Now, there's two different ways to look at the Clone Wars movie, and in this video I'm going to try to do a little bit of both of them. One is to turn back the clock, to dig into the archives of my mind and try to remember just how I felt about it the first time I saw it in theaters almost 11 years ago now, and obviously before I'd ever seen one single episode of the show that would follow, and give the movie greater context or meaning. The other way is of course the opposite, to compare it and contrast it against what the show, all 6 soon-to-be 7 seasons of it, ultimately became, and to judge it more off its place in the greater whole, and to talk about how the movie was a rough start to something that, slowly but surely, would turn out to be some of the best Star Wars that can be found anywhere in any format, something I absolutely recommend that any Star Wars fan watch. Though every time I do recommend it to someone, I throw in a little disclaimer that the first 2 seasons are nowhere near as good as the later seasons, and that there are, shall we say, some not so good episodes mixed in those first 2 seasons. In fact, most of the episodes are average at best and don't really stand out, whereas in the later seasons, almost every episode is good, if not great or even exceptional. And that's because, by then, the show has really figured out what it wants to be. Which leads to one of the biggest problems I had with the Clone Wars movie the very first time I watched it, all those years ago. I really wasn't sure what this was supposed to be or who the target audience even was. In some respects it feels very childish in that it's almost aimed at a very young crowd. Ahsoka, for example, who I couldn't stand back then, is clearly in there for kids, and I'll get more into her later. Yet in other ways it tries almost to be like a gritty war movie, and after a couple-minute introduction where we learn that Jabba's son has been kidnapped, which was a curious plot choice for the movie, and more on that one later too. Anyway, before we even know it, we're dropped right into the thick of the action, which is very Star Wars-like to just throw you right in at the start. And though nowhere near the scope and scale of, say, the Battle of Geonosis in Episode 2, or any of the battles we glimpse in Episode 3, this was still a cool, large-scale assault that we were getting to witness. In fact, both of the big battles in this, Christophsis and Teth, looked very cool and were exciting to watch and mixed wide establishing shots with more personal in-the-trenches type moments very well. And both then and now, I do like and appreciate the fact that they weren't shy about showing some pretty harsh clone trooper deaths. After all, this is the Clone Wars, set in Star Wars, so there should be some death and destruction, and it's in no short supply here. And little did I know it at the time, but the show would only continue to embrace the brutality of war more and more as it went on, and get darker and grimmer as well, which is part of what made it so great, because you really get to feel how the war begins to drag and wear down all the characters, from the clone troopers to the Jedi and everyone else. So looking back now, this was a good way to kick things off in that respect. And speaking of the troopers, another great thing about this movie is that it really begins to show you how different each individual clone trooper is, which is something the movies never had any time to get into. They all have different personalities, talk a little differently, have different haircuts, tattoos, and so on. Lots of little things to show us that they aren't an endless army of identical drones like the droid army they fight against, but rather a collection of unique individuals, despite all coming from the exact same DNA. And granted, this gets explored much more extensively in the series that would follow, and it's more or less only alluded to here in the movie, but it's clear from this, one of the goals at the start of the Clone Wars was to delve into just who these clone troopers fighting this war they had no real stake in actually were. We also start to get to see the close bond most, though not all, Jedi would form with their troopers. One of my favorite parts of the movie, especially now knowing the bond between Rex and Anakin, is when it pains Anakin to have to tell Rex they can't come to help him at one point, and Rex says how he understands and that the mission always comes first. But beyond that, there's really not a whole lot of great character moments in this movie. Yes, Samuel L. Jackson doing Windu's voice, Anthony Daniels as C-3PO, and Christopher Lee doing Dooku's voice is nice and all 3 characters sort of pop and feel more genuine to me than the others, especially Dooku, who has a much larger role in this than the other 2, and there's just something about the way Christopher Lee delivers lines that makes it a joy to listen to. But everyone else, all the soon-to-be regulars of the show, felt like they were still looking for the character or just weren't comfortable in the role yet, and there's almost no chemistry there between any of them. All these characters' interactions feel kind of stiff and disjointed, and it doesn't help that some of the dialogue was just plain bad. One part that especially sticks out to me is right as the ship Ahsoka is on is arriving, and Obi-Wan tells Anakin he hopes his new Padawan shows up and that he should put in for one too. Like you just order them off Amazon and they show up at your doorstep the next day. And that picking the right one isn't necessarily a choice a Jedi takes very, very seriously. You know, like you just fill out an order form and you get what you get. And throughout the course of the show, Obi-Wan never does get that Padawan he ordered, and he should really contact Jedi customer service about that. Anyway, it's not only the way the characters talk and interact that feels a bit stiff and rigid. The animation, too, is, like many things in this show, a far, far cry from what it would eventually become. Not that it looks terrible by any stretch, mind you, and I dare say it looks pretty damn good for a Cartoon Network show in 2008, which is where the series would eventually air. But as for a theatrical release, well, it doesn't remotely even measure up to other films at the time. Not that it was ever promised to, mind you, though I do recall critics back then panning the movie pretty hard for that reason, but not that reason alone. Because though the premise or plot for the story, having to find Jabba's son in the hopes of securing travel through Hutt space, wouldn't have been the worst one in the TV series, it's pretty weak and silly for a movie. Again, you have one aspect of this film that feels like a full-on war movie, and you're watching clone troopers getting blown to hell, yet other aspects where Jabba is calling his missing son Pookie Muffin. There's just no consistent feel or tone here at all. But at least there are some pretty decent lightsaber duels, like the ever-entertaining Ventress vs. Obi-Wan, as well as Dooku vs. Anakin. Though I was kind of under the impression from Revenge of the Sith that the last time Anakin and Dooku met was in Attack of the Clones, considering how much Dooku was looking forward to this, and how Anakin said his powers had doubled since last they met. And speaking of Revenge of the Sith and continuity, one issue I remember a lot of people having before the movie came out was how could Anakin have a Padawan between episodes 2 and 3, and how come we didn't see or haven't mentioned in Revenge of the Sith? And going into the movie, the only real issue I personally had is I didn't think that Anakin would take on a Padawan. So I was glad when he kind of got tricked into it by Yoda, though again, it does kind of take away from this idea that choosing a Padawan is a very big personal and important decision for a Jedi. But that being said, one of the amazing things about the series is that you see how both characters, Anakin and Ahsoka, grow and are shaped by each other over time. That relationship was really the heart and soul of the entire series, far more than Anakin and Obi-Wan, which is what I thought it would be going into it. And one of the things I wish is that it'd been explored just a bit more. Not that Anakin and Obi-Wan's brotherhood wasn't touched on at all, but again, I was hoping it would be a bigger focus in the series. However, as great as that Anakin-Ahsoka relationship eventually turned out to be, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't start out as a big fan of Ahsoka. Quite the opposite, really. I could not stand her in the Clone Wars movie. Now, mind you, today she's easily one of my favorite characters in all of Star Wars, right behind Luke and Palpatine, I'd say. And again, after how he was sort of tricked into it, I didn't really have a problem with the idea that Anakin had a Padawan for a time during the Clone Wars. As for not being seen or mentioned in Revenge of the Sith, which some people questioned back in the day, well, we could just assume something happened to her along the way, and she was no longer his Padawan at that time, which we now know to be the case. And if something did happen to her, it's not like Anakin would constantly be talking about it or bringing it up if it were painful, which easily explains why she's never mentioned in that movie. I mean, how strange would it be if in Revenge of the Sith, Anakin just randomly mentioned her or that he used to have a Padawan? Now, in a way, that would have been intriguing and pretty awesome and set up the eventual show, but in another, it would have just felt completely forced and out of place. And so again, I have no real issue with her more or less being inserted into the story after the fact. And speaking of Ahsoka and Episode 3, I remember we were initially told, in regards to the Clone Wars series at least, that it would not only eventually connect to Revenge of the Sith and overlap with it a little bit, but that it would actually go a little bit past it. And when I walked out of that theater almost 11 years ago now, I remember thinking to myself, hopefully someday we'll get to see Darth Vader vs. Ahsoka, that somehow she'll survive that long. But not because I thought it'd ultimately be a great duel to see, but because I really wanted to see Darth Vader kill her. She was just that annoying to me in that movie. And I know that's a bit harsh, and again, she's one of my favorite characters now, but it sure didn't start out that way. And I like to tell myself now that they intentionally made her that annoying in order to really showcase her growth throughout the show, but I don't know if I can buy that. I again think this was a case of not knowing exactly who the intended audience was going to be. Either that or they really did plan to start it out aimed at kids, and then to grow or raise the maturity level of the show with the audience, or as the kids watching it got older. And if that is truly how they planned it, well then bravo. In closing here, when I saw the Clone Wars movie for the first time, I wasn't impressed to say the least. Sure, now I can look back and appreciate what it started, but back then, I had no way of knowing what it'd ultimately become. All the movie did for me then was lessen my interest for the series that began a few months later. And when you stripped away all the battles in the movie, which were again pretty cool and great to see, all you're left with is animation not quite worthy of the big screen, a pretty silly bare-bones story and some rough dialogue and character interactions, and a character that I absolutely hated at first. And even looking back at it now after having watched it again just the other night, it's still not very good. Yes, it is the first appearance of what would turn out to be one of the best, most well-developed characters in the entire franchise, that being Ahsoka. I mean, the fact that one day I would get my requested Vader vs. Ahsoka duel, and instead of wanting Vader to just kill her, I was actually hoping she would live. Well, that's testament to the show's ability to tell great stories and develop fantastic characters, but there's no way of denying this movie just wasn't very good. And as I mentioned earlier, the first couple seasons of the show are not the greatest either, but I will be rewatching the whole series yet again in chronological order, one episode per night for the next 3.5 months or so, and I will be doing a few videos about it along the way and delving deeper into the series and its characters and building up to Season 7 of the Clone Wars, as well as discussing each individual episode on my Discord server for those of you who support me on Patreon, and if you're interested in becoming a patron, a link to that will be in the description below. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me your thoughts on the Clone Wars movie then and now. Did you love it or hate it back in the day? Has your opinion on it changed at all over the years or not? Or maybe have you never seen it before? Let me know what you think in the comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.